2, 3.
Well, we are here today on Homespun with Congressman in the 4th District, Steve King. And Congressman, we'd like to welcome you here to the show today. And it's a pleasure having you here. Congratulations on your recent victory. How many times is that in a row for you now?
Well, let's see. I think this is the 9th term in Congress, and then we've also twice elected to the Iowa Senate. So I look back, and I wasn't really keeping score on that, but my youngest son, Jeff King, has been my campaign chairman for some time.
Sure.
And he's managed a lot of these campaigns, so he's like 14-0, and I think I'm 17-0 altogether.
Sure. I guess one of my number one questions on that, Jeff, I think Jeff does a great job as your campaign manager. Are you kind of grooming him to go into politics and let him make a run one of these days?
You know, it's funny, we really haven't talked about that.
Seriously?
Yes, it's we just do our work, and it isn't like we intentionally evade the topic, but we just haven't
Sure.
talked about it. But I also think of my oldest son, Dave. We never talked about him taking over the business, and he owns that company today, and he's doing well.
Correct. Tell me a little bit about Steve King. What did you do before politics?
Well, I was in the construction business. I started a construction company back in 1975, and one day I was out there building terraces, working for another fella, and I started working this through my mind. I had a negative net worth of $5,000. That was a pretty big hole back then.
Yeah.
And
It is now too.
yes, it is. Any kind of hole is a bad one to be in. And but I had convinced a banker to loan me 100% of an old beaten-up bulldozer, and it was in the weeds out in Nebraska, weeds growing up around it. I drug it home into the yard, welded on it for 2 weeks, and rolled it out and put it to work. And 3 hours later, and it was Labor Day of 1975, 10 o'clock in the morning, the engine blew up. So we started all over again and had to strip it all the way down to the block and build it all back. And about a week later, my wife is standing up on the tracks of that old D7 with a 7-foot cheater pipe, torquing the head bolts in the rain, and she's 4.5 months pregnant with that little boy that now owns that company.
Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. So you went from construction to politics.
Mhm.
A little bit of a different animal there.
Well,
I
yeah.
kind of have read the stories of why you got interested in it and how you got interested in it, but I want to hear it from you.
Well, I got frustrated with what government was doing to change the rules. And you know, when you're in heavy equipment and moving dirt and digging holes and doing all the things that we did, when you pull the lever on a machine, something happens, and usually the thing you want to move moves.
Sure.
And so I noticed that they kept changing the rules on me in Des Moines and in Washington. And so I would go down to Des Moines and I would try to lobby my state senators and lobby my state house, and it just didn't seem like I was getting things done. And one day I was talking to a state senator, and it was on something that I thought was relatively non-controversial, and I just saw his eyes glaze over while I was talking to him. We've all seen our kids do that, and I thought,
You're losing them.
I need to start all over. I could bring him back if I would have snapped my fingers, but we needed people that really believed this and understood it. And I went home to recruit somebody to run against my state senator, and they said, "No, Steve, you should be the one." And I said, I'm not gonna take your word for that. I'm gonna go see Bob. Well, then the first guy I was talking to called Bob, I didn't know it, and said, "You need to tell Steve to run." And by the time I tried 4 or 5 of those fellas, I really had a kitchen cabinet that encouraged me to run. That's how I got involved in politics.
Sure. And it was a different animal back then. When you started, one of the big words back there was gridlock. And that's what we were all experiencing at that time. I think you've brought us to the point where you've shown that things can get done. And sometimes you have to be a little hard-nosed to do it. And when you do things like that, you're going to get the opposition. And in the last, since the cheering and the campaign and the victory, it's been quite a month for you. And critics have seemingly came out of the closet and out of the woodwork. I guess the number one thing would be this: how do you address the slams on you, calling you a racist?
Well, up until election night, I didn't. I just said there's no basis for it, and therefore I'm not going to go down that path of trying to argue against a negative, because you can't really prove a negative. You can't disprove a negative. I saw the results election night. I saw what they did with a full court press, with multi-billionaires from the West Coast and from the East Coast coming in here to try to buy an election and try to force me out under some of the nastiest politics we've seen in the country, and I think the worst we've ever seen in the history of Iowa. So now how do I address the racism piece of this? First, there's never been any basis for it. No one can go back and come up with an original quote, a statement, or an action that would support those allegations.
Correct.
So I still have to disprove this negative attack on me. So let me just give that a little bit of a try. For example, I went down to Southern Africa to promote the PEPFAR program, which is the antiretroviral drugs. I went into the AIDS villages there and worked with those kids, and they were I saw some of the worst parts of the world in those places. And I led the standing ovation on the floor when George Bush announced in his State of the Union address, and I promoted it all along since then. Fast forward throughout the years, you know a little bit, I think, about the Tanzanian miracle kids. And those kids, the 3 survivors of a bus load of 38, Dr. Steve Meyer has said this publicly many times, they would be dead today if it hadn't been for Steve King. Well, here is everybody else piling millions of dollars of negative attacks on my head, calling me a racist, and what are we doing? We're doing fundraising events for the Tanzanian miracle kids in the middle of all of that.
Sure.
But the press doesn't show up. And on the Thursday before the Tuesday election, we organized a fundraising event down at Glen Oaks Country Club for the Tanzanian miracle kids and the STEM auction of Dr. Steve Meyer. And we raised between $30,000 and $40,000 that night. Marilyn and I have sponsored 3 students in Tanzania that for at least 2 years, and one earlier than that, but I know at least 3 for at least 2 years. And so we're trying to educate these black African kids that are disadvantaged in Tanzania. We're raising money for the orphanage and money for the school. And we're engaged in it pretty deeply. Raised something between, I say, close to $70,000 in the last 2 years for those kids. So how do you call somebody a racist that's that deeply dedicated, that saves the lives of some and followed them all the way through their recovery process? And additionally, Marilyn and I were on the tarmac at Kilimanjaro Airport to be there to welcome those kids back home into their home country after they had recovered here in Northwest Iowa. And those, one is a Muslim girl, the other 2 are generally Christians, and even the Muslim moms couldn't stop hugging me for what I'd been involved in. And I'm only one link in the chain of miracles.
Sure.
I'm not taking all credit for this, but I'm making it clear the part I did do.
Right. And isn't it funny that, like you said, the press didn't show up for that? And perhaps you need to get a publicity expert on your side and just to target some of those things. And I know politicians, when you do that, then you're going to be accused of blowing your own horn. But sometimes that has to be necessary. I have a statement, of course, one of the other things that you're kind of in the hot seat. Although Kim Reynolds has not talked to you, and I know personally, you're one of her biggest cheerleaders. She was, very, very powerful as far as the heartbeat bill, and I know that you've been nothing but supportive of that. But and I know that she hasn't talked to you after the election, because even the Des Moines Register said that she's not talked to you since the election. She publicly said that to the reporter. And here's what the quote was. Reynolds says she hasn't talked with the Iowa congressman because she has been busy since the election. But she added, I think that Steve King needs to make a decision if he wants to represent the people and the values of the 4th District or do something else. And I think he needs to take a look at that. How do you respond to this?
Well, she needed to pick up the phone and call me. That didn't happen. And I am disappointed by that, especially because I've been with and a supporter of Kim Reynolds, taking her clear back when she was a county treasurer in Clark County. And when it was time, when that seat opened up, when Jeff Angelo left the Iowa Senate, we went down and encouraged Kim to run in that state Senate seat. I put some of my people in there to help her, and I helped her with with advice and with the things that I could do. And she came out of a 3-way primary. And then people should remember also that when she was nominated for lieutenant governor, Bob Vanderplatz was the competitor in that. And he had, he'd lost in a primary to Terry Branstad for governor, but he had a lot of support. Most people thought that he would be the nominee for lieutenant governor. I didn't think you should have those kind of competitors as governor or lieutenant governor on the ticket, and I nominated Kim Reynolds at the state convention. Most people would tell you that she would not have won that nomination if I hadn't stepped up to make that nomination. And so, of all of this path along, I've been a full supporter of Kim Reynolds. I love the lady. She's been a friend to me. This cannot be explained in any way other than she's got some of the wrong people around her that she listened to. But she has my cell phone. She could have called me. She should have done that. And by the way, the question needs to go to her, not to me. What is her criticism? What's the original source? What statement or action might I have made, or statements or actions might I have made that were so egregious that she would risk splitting the Republican Party in the state of Iowa with a statement like that?
And with a generality.
Right.
And not a specific. And so how do you answer a specific, obviously on the spur of the moment? It probably caught her as off guard as it caught you
But
when
Mark,
it came out.
It didn't catch her off guard. The picture's in the Sioux City Journal of her note card, and she stated exactly the verbatim text of her note card that she was. So she walked in there planning to say that, which is why I think she's got some of the wrong people around her.
Okay, all right. What are some of the other controversies that you're facing right now, Steve? Things that you really want to, have a voice on?
Well, as far as the controversies are concerned, I have faced the worst negative attacks that anybody has seen in the history of the state of Iowa. I'm the only Republican member of the Iowa congressional delegation that's still standing. That ought to be worth something. They spent millions of dollars to try to peel voters off, and they probably peeled off 20,000 or so. Spent millions to peel off about 20,000 voters that would have otherwise voted for me. That's what negative attacks do, though, is they cause people to skip you on the ballot.
Sure.
Plus, you couldn't vote straight ticket this time, so that was exploited. And this has not been evaluated very well by people, that they just jump to their conclusion that supports their narrative. But there's also this, that on October 25th, a writer for the Washington Post wrote a story. His name is Mike DeMonis. And he wrote a story that it said that apparently that alleged that I had essentially duped a Jewish group to fund my trip to Europe to sit down with neo-Nazis and anti-Semites in a meeting in Vienna. That's the story, the Washington Post. And before you could get a hold of that and correct it, it was repeated scores of times across the country. And you saw the Huffington Post come in, the New York Times come in, a bunch of others, many, many others. I can't begin to name them all.
Right.
But that story was false. The headline was false, the first sentence was false, and the entire narrative was predicated on the headline and the first sentence. And then, but here's the truth, and that is that Marilyn and I did go to Auschwitz and Birkenau as guests of the From the Depths, which is a Jewish organization that wants members of Congress to see the reality of the Holocaust. Mm-hmm. We did that. I told them from the beginning, I have a side trip I need to do to Vienna, because I'd accepted an invitation to sit down with some business people there and do a download on U.S. politics. I bought my plane ticket, nobody bought it but me. And I flew from Warsaw to Vienna. I did the meeting, I flew back to Warsaw and caught the flight. I went back to the United States. That was on my own time, it was on my own dime. But at that table, they alleged that they were Nazi sympathizers at this table, Nazi-connected people, and I've never met a Nazi that I know of in my life, and that they were also anti-Semitics. So this is supposedly some kind of a plot. They allege that it was a meeting to try to move a Nazi anti-Semitic agenda of some kind. I don't know what's in their imagination, but I know who was at the table. I didn't when I walked in the room, but I know. And it started out this way. 5 or 6 of us seated around a table, and I knew the host. He sat on my left. The individual on my right, and this is going to sound like it's on, but if the individual on my right, in that little pause of who's going to talk first, he said this. He said, "I think you should know, Congressman, that you're seated at the table with 2 homosexuals and a Jew." And immediately the gentleman across the table said, "Well, who's the Jew?" And everybody laughed because they understood that he knew who the other homosexual was.
Right.
And I didn't know who the Jew was when he said that either.
Right.
But that was how that meeting started. So I'm saying this, that if you're going to do some kind of Nazi anti-Semitic plot, you're not going to be doing it at the table with homosexuals and Jews.
Right.
It couldn't be any more opposite, but they created this entire narrative out of this, and with the stories they said were false, and then the New York Times, and by the way, reproducing an article written by Art Cullen of the Storm Lake Times, and he has been one who has attacked me for over 20 years, that stated that that meeting was at the headquarters of the Freedom Party, whom they allege are, a far-right group. They're the governing majority in Austria, but the meeting was not at those headquarters. That story was, I'd like to just say simply false, but it was a flat-out lie. And we saw lie after lie come out. We called up editors and told them what the truth was. They refused to change it because it didn't fit their narrative. This national news media is so bad. The public cannot begin to comprehend how bad this is. And then when you get on, I'll call them the cyber bullies, the big internet outfits that are there, that's so pervasive that you cannot even quantify it. But I can give you an example of how bad it was. The advertisement that was bought everywhere, you couldn't get away from it. For example, my 7-year-old granddaughter, Reagan Ann King, was playing a little computer game, a kid's computer game on her phone, and up pops an ad that tells her that her grandfather is a Nazi. That's how bad this is and was. And America's got to come to grips with this, or it's going to alter the culture and the politics of America in an irreversible, irrevocable way, Mark.
We talk about this a lot as far as the media and which direction it's heading sometimes. Media is just as influenced by money and finances as everything else. When you say things are not on the agenda or things can't be changed because it doesn't fit with their narrative, what you're really saying is it doesn't fit with their economic structure. And you're just being very kind, but I'll put it right out there because, as being a journalist and part of the media, that's exactly it. What stories you print, what stories sell most newspapers, we've got to get back to that idea of truth in journalism instead of looking at the monetary bottom line on things. And that's the shame of what's going on in America right now as far as the media goes.
And I'm glad you've spoken to this, Mark. And there's an analysis out there that takes what you've described and divides it even further in this, that the newspapers and the publications, in particular internet or print, they're either left or right today for the most part at the national level.
Right.
And so they get paid by the click. So if they can write stories with a catchy headline and people will click on that, then the advertisers pay them for that. So if they're going to be, say, Washington Post, hardcore left, owned by Jeff Bezos, maybe the richest man in the world today, he has an agenda and it's a leftist agenda. So they want all the clicks they can get on the leftist agenda, the Washington Post. It may not be the same situation for, say, the Washington Times, when you get a bit of the other flavor for that. Or Breitbart would be a better example of that.
Yes.
More on the right side. If they can get a lot of clicks